It began with a death no one could explain inside a police cell that was supposed to be safe. His name was Albert Ojang, a young Kenyan man detained at Central Police Station in Nairobi. The cell had CCTV cameras, yet the footage vanished. Someone, bold, confident, untouchable, turned off the truth. That single act became the spark for one of the most powerful speeches in Kenya's parliament. Standing before the nation's Senator Edwin Sifuna looked straight into the speaker's eyes and said, "This is what impunity looks like." In that moment, the chamber fell silent. It was no longer just about one man's death, it was about a nation's soul. How could a system built to protect become the executioner? How could the rule of law decay in the very house that gave birth to Kenya's constitution? Sifuna reminded the country what that constitution once meant: a promise to protect the individual, the family, the community, and the nation in that order. Because when the individual dies in darkness, the entire nation loses its light. This was not a speech of politics. It was a speech of remembrance, a plea to restore the dignity that once defined Kenya's democracy. He wasn't just speaking to lawmakers. He was speaking to every African who has ever feared the sound of police boots at night. And perhaps to every American watching from afar, asking quietly, how many times must history repeat itself before we learn that justice once silenced always finds another voice? Because from Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from the trembling streets of Kenya to the hopeful heart of Burkina Faso, a new generation of Africans is rising, demanding a nation that fears no truth. So stay with us, because what Senator Edwin Sifuna said next shook Kenya and reminded Africa what real courage sounds like. The story that echoed through Kenya's parliament that day began not with politics, but with a body in a police cell. Albert Ojang was found dead in the custody of the very institution meant to protect him, the Central Police Station of Nairobi. The tragedy was already haunting enough, but what followed turned outrage into disbelief. CCTV cameras had been installed inside that station, cameras funded by the taxpayer designed to ensure accountability. Yet when investigators from the Independent Policing Oversight Authority (IPOA) demanded the footage, it had mysteriously disappeared. Someone inside that building, an officer of the law, had disabled the evidence that could have told the truth. Senator Edwin Sifuna, the Secretary General of the Orange Democratic Movement (ODM), rose in Parliament not as a politician, but as a citizen, a father, a teacher, and a lawyer, determined to remind Kenya who they once were. He began by recalling the very words written in the preamble of Kenya's 2010 Constitution. It was a moment of national reflection. When we passed this constitution, he said, we were in a certain frame of mind. We were promising to nurture and protect the well-being of the individual, the family, the community, and the nation. Sifuna explained that those words were not random. Their order carried meaning: the individual comes first. Because if one citizen can be tortured or killed without consequence, then the Constitution becomes nothing more than paper. He reminded lawmakers that Kenya's founding promise was to create a government based on the essential values of human rights, equality, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law in that exact sequence. Human rights first, he said firmly. That was deliberate. It was an uncomfortable mirror held up to a nation where the police force, a pillar of law, had instead become a symbol of fear. Sifuna's voice trembled with both grief and defiance as he recited Article 25, the section that defines 4 rights that cannot be suspended or taken away under any circumstance. Freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Freedom from slavery or servitude. The right to a fair trial. The right to an order of habeas corpus, the right to be produced before a court if detained. Then, in a tone that sliced through the silence of Parliament, he declared, "The culture of impunity we've created is what gives a police officer the courage to switch off a camera and commit murder in a cell, the very place we're told should be safest." For a moment, the chamber froze. What he had said wasn't just about Albert Ojang. It was about every Kenyan who had ever been detained, disappeared, or silenced. Sifuna turned his words into a lesson, a reminder that the Constitution was born out of pain, written after decades of abductions, torture, and detention without trial. He asked the speaker to imagine the mindset of a people who had survived that history only to watch it return in 2025. He wasn't lecturing for applause. He was building a moral case. Every word felt like a charge, every phrase like a wound reopened. If we do not protect the individual, he warned, then the family, the community, and the nation will all collapse one after another. As his speech went on, Sifuna's argument became clear the problem wasn't the absence of laws, it was the absence of conscience. Kenya already had cameras, oversight bodies, and constitutional guarantees. But without integrity, all these mechanisms were hollow. He ended the first part of his address with a haunting truth. In a country where murder can be edited out of CCTV, justice has already been deleted from the nation's heart. It was not a statement meant to stir anger, it was meant to awaken a country. Because what happened to Albert Ojang, Sifuna warned, was not a tragedy, it was a test. A test of whether Kenya still remembered what justice feels like. As Senator Edwin Sifuna's words grew sharper, the tension inside Parliament became almost physical. He wasn't just addressing the speaker anymore, he was addressing a nation in denial. The chamber filled with lawyers, party loyalists, and government allies began to shift uneasily, and then came the moment that turned a speech into confrontation. He directly named his colleague Senator Samson Cherarki, who had earlier defended the police. Cherarki had dismissed the outrage over Albert Ojang's death as an exaggeration of political performance. That was the breaking point. Sifuna's voice cut through the air like a blade. How can you, a lawyer, a lawmaker, defend the torture of your own citizens? Have we become so numb to injustice that we can no longer tell right from wrong? The chamber erupted. Several senators stood shouting, "Order, order," others clapped quietly, nodding in agreement. The speaker struck his gavel again and again, but the moment had already ignited something larger than protocol. Sifuna pressed on. He reminded them that torture and abduction were not abstract ideas. They were lived realities, both in Kenya and across the border. He spoke of Tundu Lissu, the Tanzanian opposition leader who survived an assassination attempt and now faces endless trials. He recalled John Heche, another activist arrested simply for crossing the border to mourn a friend. "These are my friends," Sifuna said, his voice heavy. "If you don't have friends beyond your county, that's your problem. But don't tell me not to speak about the suffering of those who fight for democracy." A senator from the government benches rose angrily, citing Standing Order 10111, which prohibits members from discussing judicial proceedings in friendly countries. But Sifuna wasn't intimidated. He turned to the speaker and said calmly but firmly, "I know the judges' names. I know the officers who commit torture. But I haven't mentioned them. I am speaking of humanity, not politics." The room went silent again, this time not from order, but from shame. He then turned his fury inward toward his own party. Some within ODM, he said, had betrayed the movement's founding principles: justice, dignity, and resistance against oppression. "Some people wear our colors," he said bitterly, "but they don't represent our values. Those are not our people. Those are not our colors." It was a moment of moral cleansing. He invoked Raila Odinga, the party's founding leader, who had spent 9 years imprisoned without trial under past regimes. "Our party leader was tortured, his family suffered, his children grew up without a father, all because he demanded freedom. And now, some of you wearing our caps defend the same cruelty he fought against." Every word felt like a thunderclap, not just against the police, but against cowardice within the political class. Then came the line that electrified the chamber. "The safest places in Kenya have become the most dangerous. Our cells are killing grounds, our constitution is bleeding, and you call yourselves patriots." Even those who opposed him could not look away. The room had become a courtroom, and Sifuna was both prosecutor and witness. He demanded that Kenya remember what it once fought for, that the Constitution was not just a document, but a collective cry against fear. He reminded them that the phrase "freedom from torture" was written by survivors, not politicians. By the time he finished, there were no more interruptions. Even his fiercest rivals stayed seated. The applause was hesitant, then grew louder, a ripple that spread across the chamber. Outside Parliament, Sifuna's words began trending across social media. The hashtags Jana Justice for Albert and Nanaim Stop Police Brutality Kenya filled timelines within hours. Young activists, old veterans of Kenya's democracy movement, and ordinary citizens all repeated one phrase: "The safest places have become the most dangerous." That sentence, simple, haunting, undeniable, became the heartbeat of a new wave of civic outrage. In that instant, Sifuna had done what few dared. He had forced Kenya to look into the mirror and see its own reflection in the darkness of a police cell. When the echoes of Senator Sifuna's speech faded from Parliament, the real conversation began in the streets. In Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, cities that have long carried the weight of broken promises, people started to ask the same question: if Albert Ojang could die in custody, who is safe? The Independent Policing Oversight Authority (IPOA) released an update just days later. It confirmed what Sifuna had hinted at since January: at least 20 young people had died inside police cells. Many more were reported missing, with families still searching morgues and hospitals in silence. Another report from human rights monitors painted an even darker picture: nearly 60 people killed by extrajudicial actions between January and June. The statistics no longer felt like numbers. They were named sons, daughters, breadwinners, and the public knew it. In Nairobi's central square, activists gathered carrying handwritten placards: "Cameras are not for decoration. Justice for Albert." The Constitution is not optional. Parents who once feared speaking out began to share stories of sons taken in the night. Mothers described visiting police stations where officers refused to record missing persons reports. What Sifuna had said in Parliament was now being whispered in homes, shouted in protests, and written across online feeds. For the political class, it was a reckoning. The ruling coalition scrambled to frame the issue as an isolated incident, but the damage had already been done. For the first time in years, police reform returned to the top of Kenya's national agenda. Legal experts called for a complete review of police standard operating procedures, SOPs, the same reforms Sifuna had demanded in his speech. The proposal sought to integrate human rights compliance training, independent digital archives for surveillance footage, and mandatory public reporting of in-custody deaths. Within weeks, a new civic alliance began forming. Lawyers, activists, clergy, and even a few retired officers joined hands to push what they called the People's Safety Charter. Their message was clear: safety and dignity are not privileges, they are birthrights. But inside Parliament, the resistance was fierce. Some lawmakers dismissed it as anti-police propaganda. Others accused Sifuna of weakening national security. He responded publicly saying, "A nation is not made weaker by justice. It is made stronger by accountability." The debate spilled over into the courts. Families of victims filed petitions demanding compensation and full public disclosure of case files. Judges began citing Article 25, the same one Sifuna had quoted in their rulings, reinforcing that freedom from torture and arbitrary detention cannot be suspended under any condition. Slowly, something was shifting. The narrative of fear was being replaced by a quiet, collective defiance. On the night of a candlelight vigil held for Albert Ojang, thousands gathered outside the Central Police Station. They didn't chant political slogans. They simply stood in silence. The same silence that once protected impunity was now being used to honor its victims. A journalist covering the vigil wrote, "What Senator Sifuna began in Parliament, the people finished in the streets." It was not a protest. It was a mirror held up to the nation. That was the power of one voice speaking truth inside a hall built on compromise. It reminded Kenya and Africa that justice does not begin in the courts. It begins in conscience. When clips of Senator Edwin Sifuna's speech reached international media, they struck a nerve far beyond Kenya's borders. Across the Atlantic, in Washington and New York, human rights organizations recognized the language: freedom from torture, habeas corpus, rule of law. It was the same vocabulary used in the civil rights struggles that once defined America's own moral battles. On U.S. talk shows and digital news panels, analysts described Sifuna's speech as the closest thing Africa has seen to a moral courtroom inside Parliament. The New York Times highlighted it under the headline, "A Senator Dares to Speak for the Dead." American observers drew parallels between the George Floyd movement and the Justice for Albert Ojang campaign. In both, citizens rose to question the same haunting truth that law enforcement, when unchecked, can become the very threat it was created to prevent. At the United Nations Human Rights Council, the Kenyan delegation faced new scrutiny. Western diplomats, careful not to sound accusatory, raised concerns about police accountability and digital transparency. Meanwhile, African delegates from Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Senegal privately praised Sifuna's courage. One West African ambassador reportedly said, "What he said in that chamber, that is what Africa has been afraid to say for decades." Justice begins when one of us dares to name the fear. The Burkina press went further, comparing Sifuna's words to the spirit of President Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader who insists that a nation cannot be sovereign if its people live in fear of their own police. In Ouagadougou, local newspapers wrote editorials linking the two voices, one in parliament, one in power, both speaking against the silent violence that has long defined post-colonial systems. African scholars began to frame the speech within a broader movement, a pan-African awakening demanding not only sovereignty from foreign powers, but sovereignty from domestic tyranny. Freedom, one writer argued, means nothing if the black hand that holds the whip has replaced the white one. In Europe, human rights networks translated the speech into French and German, broadcasting it as a teaching tool in law schools and civic leadership programs. In Africa's diaspora, particularly among African Americans, the reaction was visceral. Many saw in Sifuna the same moral defiance that echoed in Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, a man appealing not to law, but to conscience. As one retired U.S. Senator told PBS, "This is the kind of moral leadership we used to hear in our own Congress." He wasn't asking for power. He was demanding accountability. That's what democracy sounds like when it's alive. And yet, the most powerful resonance came not from diplomats or journalists, but from ordinary people. A Kenyan nurse living in Chicago wrote online, "When Sifuna spoke, I felt like he was speaking for all of us who left home because justice was dying." From Nairobi to New York, from parliament halls to candlelit vigils, one truth connected them all. The struggle for justice has no borders. It was no longer just Kenya's debate. It was a question the entire world had to face. How long can democracies survive when the defenders of law become its violators? When the applause ended and the parliament lights dimmed, Kenya was left with a silence more powerful than any speech. It was the silence of recognition, the moment a nation sees itself clearly, even if it doesn't like what it finds. Senator Edwin Sifuna didn't just speak for Albert Ojang. He spoke for a country that has watched too many sons buried under police silence. He spoke for a continent wrestling with its conscience, where constitutions promise freedom, but fear still walks in uniform. His warning was simple, yet terrifying. If we forget the individual, the nation will follow. Those words were not just for Kenya. They were for every place where power hides behind uniforms and laws, and where justice is treated as an inconvenience. Because this isn't only Africa's struggle, it's humanity's. The same moral rot that allows a man to die unseen in Nairobi is the one that allowed George Floyd to die with a knee on his neck in Minneapolis. It is what silences women in Sudan, what breaks journalists in Uganda, what jails thinkers in Ethiopia. And yet, hope survives not because of governments, but because of people. When Sifuna spoke truth to power, it was a reminder that courage is still contagious. And across the continent, from Ibrahim Traoré's Burkina Faso to the streets of Accra and Gaborone, a generation is rising that refuses to be ruled by fear. These are not leaders seeking applause. They are citizens demanding dignity. And that is how change begins, not with revolutions of violence, but with revolutions of memory. So to those watching from afar, from the quiet living rooms of America to the restless streets of Africa, remember, this democracy dies, not when dictators rise, but when good people stop defending the truth. If you are moved by this story, don't let it fade into another headline. Share it. Speak about it. Ask the hard questions. Because as Sifuna's words remind us, and as Ibrahim Traoré's actions prove, sovereignty means nothing without justice. And justice begins the moment we refuse to look away. Please share if you believe that truth must never be silenced. Subscribe if you still believe that the law should protect the powerless, not empower the cruel.